It's time to react to the video, the Johnny Harris video. The USA loves to meddle in other countries. We all know that he's like an idealist, liberal who tries to frame US interventionism as like based on values rather than material interests. So let's see how this goes. He used to work for the State Department, by the way, and he's like an expert at like being like, sure, the USA did all of these bad things, but China. Wow.
There's
sinister
a
ambient. It literally sinister ambient music. Sinister ambient music. Great. I love the subtitles. You know that he got these from like a caption farm like rev.com because they make you do that.
There's a weapon that powerful countries use to get rid of leaders they don't like, leaders from other countries. It's called a coup. It's a French word that means a punch or a blow.
Is this for aliens? I'm sorry, was this written for aliens? Like people who've never heard of like the most basic political term? This is literally like explaining US interventionism to an alien.
Oh, because it kind of means coming in and forcibly punching out a government from power. No elections, no process, just power being seized. Just someone being pushed out and someone being put in. Coups happen in so many different ways, but I want to show you how the coup has been used by the United States of America as a tool to get what they want on the world stage. So let me walk you through some of the major US-led coups over the years to show you that while it sometimes seems like we live in a world full of order and rules, the reality is that the most powerful countries will often get their way by whatever means necessary.
Whoa.
Okay, so here's how I'm defining the US-led coups that I'm going to put on our list here. Number one, they were successful. There's a lot of failed coup attempts. We're leaving those out. Number two, there must be at least one US government official involved in the coup. And number three...
What does that mean? Like a United States government official involved in the coup? I don't know how he thinks this works. Does this mean that like someone like who's like a member of the cabinet, like orders the coup? I don't think that ever actually happens. It's never actually that simple.
Concrete evidence that the US was actually involved, not just speculation.
When they talk about concrete evidence like that, it's very convenient for them because the concrete evidence always comes directly from the US government. Always. They always like reluctantly declassify documents that they leave very, very, very heavily redacted. Usually they do it as like because like another branch of government got pissed off at the CIA and like tried to get some disclosures happening, or like another country like 40, 50 years later, long after the event, they're like, hey, USA, pretty please give us some documents. And the USA is like, well, we think like, the clout that we would, like the diplomatic leverage that we'd get from you, from like releasing heavily redacted, highly selected documents regarding this event would outweigh like the bad PR from us releasing them. So we're going to release some of them and make it look like we're being transparent when we're really not. So this standard of evidence here, like direct evidence of US involvement, as in basically the US government outright admitting it, or at least indirectly admitting it by releasing documents that make it clear that they were involved, you're just defining out a ton of coups, a ton of US government regime change operations already. Because obviously when you need a clear admission by the culprit or the culprit themselves giving evidence, that's kind of a shitty fucking standard of evidence right there. Because they don't do that unless they have some ulterior motive for doing so or they're otherwise forced to. And even when they do it, what they release is so heavily selected and redacted that it is so much less useful than it would otherwise be.
While the US has been involved in tons of regime change efforts around the world, we landed on a much shorter list. These are the coups that I think best exemplify how this tool has been used for international power over the years.
This is so sinister.
Let's start here. In the independent country of Hawaii. It's 1893, and the US is feeling like the Hawaiian queen is a threat to American control over sugar. It's sugar that's being grown by the descendants of white American missionaries who had settled in Hawaii over the years. So the US sends a military ship with hundreds of troops to show up to Honolulu, and they overthrow the queen, installing one of those descendants of the Christian missionaries, Sanford B. Dole, as the new president. Notice his last name? Yeah, this coup was one of the US's first, and it set the stage not only for the new...
Was it?
Hawaiian president's family to grow their powerful international corporation, which was based in Hawaii, but also for Hawaii to be annexed, to become a part of the United States. I made a whole video on this coup because it's pretty wild and there's so much going on here, and it was really a turning point in showing how the US could remove leaders from power in faraway places, something that they start to do a lot more of. We're going to move on to the next coup, but I need to thank today's sponsor who...
You're not thanking any sponsor in my video.
We got a lot more to cover on these coups. The next coup has to do with Spain. Well, actually more like Spain's colonies. Spain's glory days have come and gone. They are a declining empire, and there is major resistance in their colonies, especially in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Meanwhile, the US is a rising empire, and they already are pretty uncomfortable with Spain having colonies like 100 miles off their coast. But at the same time, they don't love the idea of true independence for places like Cuba or Puerto Rico. These are strategic islands right in the US's neighborhood. And like Hawaii, American companies
It's in their neighborhood, okay?
have money invested, particularly in Cuba. Independence might mean them getting kicked out. So the US delves into this fight between Spain and their colonies. They use the explosion of an American Navy ship as their excuse, even though it was likely an accident, not an attack. But sometimes stories
It is kind of interesting how they were like, we need direct evidence of US involvement, but in this case they are happy to say it was likely like a false flag. I guess just because it's convenient for them in this moment, so the standard of evidence doesn't happen to apply here.
matter more than truth. So the US sends in troops to liberate the rebels fighting against their Spanish colonizers, promising them independence. Not only in Cuba and Puerto Rico, but later over here in the Philippines and Guam. These local uprisings eventually drive out the Spanish. And in all of these cases, the US reneges on their promise to give independence to these locals. And they figure out ways to govern Cuba and Puerto Rico indirectly themselves. The US has just piggybacked off several independence movements to enact several coups at once, allowing them to install pro-American leaders and a Navy base in Cuba, and eventually annexing Puerto Rico and Guam, which they still control, and the Philippines, which they held for 48 years. Again, I made a whole video about this one too if you want to go deeper. Anyway, we gotta move a little quick.
Should have mentioned as well what they did once Cuba finally broke free of that US domination. But yeah, it is kind of interesting that he's calling these coups. These weren't coups, they were just plain military domination, like straight up conquest sort of thing. You know, the entire reason why, at least what I know of Cuba, is Puerto Rico was literally, you know, it's a part of the United States. This wasn't a coup. This was annexation, for example. The Philippines was also part of straight up like a US governed colony. Cuba wasn't so much. It was more informal because I guess the independence movement there was stronger. So they had to associate them a little bit more, but it was still, for all intents and purposes, controlled by the USA through a constitutional amendment that they put into the Cuban constitution that basically said the US has the right to do anything they wanted there. So I wouldn't call these coups. I think the framing of the video is off. I don't know how. You would assume that these are made by a team, that there's people who would be like, hey, shouldn't we just make this video about like intervention, like a military intervention or some sort of intervention in general, rather than specifically about coups? Because our very first examples aren't really coups. They're actually just annexations. They're actually just straight up irredentist conquest. It's not really the same thing.
Here, because we're not going to get through all these coups. Let's move on. Okay, so we're over here in Nicaragua. It's 1909. There's a bunch of powerful American companies here, but a new president comes to power vowing to regulate them. The US is not going to let this happen. So the Secretary of State starts spreading rumors to smear this guy, this president, saying that he's building a canal that would compete with the Panama Canal. But really, they're just upset because
that would be based.
Nicaragua is taking loans from Europe. The US keeps painting this guy as a war criminal and someone worthy of being thrown out. So push comes to shove, and the US sends ships to both of Nicaragua's coasts. They assemble a bunch of Marines in Panama, basically just flexing on Nicaragua and telling the president to step down. And the benefit of being a rising superpower is that it worked. He has no choice but to step down. And soon, a leader that the US likes comes to power. The coup is complete, and really, this is the first of many instances of the US meddling in Nicaragua. A few years later, the US is back in the region for another coup in next-door Honduras. This one was plotted by a band of...
I'm curious to see, at the end of the video, how this is rationalized. Like, what's the point, basically? Is the point just to, state what happened, or does he have some sort of wider point? Because I don't understand how a liberal can look through all of this, even with, the weird framing, can look through all of this, 100+ years of intervention, coups for US material interests, and then not be like, maybe this is just a part of the USA. Maybe this is just what the USA is. Maybe it's not. It's not a problem of ideals. Maybe it's not a problem of morality. Maybe it's just that the USA, as this world-dominating imperial power, does these things because it's good for them. It doesn't matter to them how bad they are for the other people who actually live in these places. So what is the conclusion going to be? That is the big question here.
Private American citizens, and it follows a similar pattern. A new president comes to town, in this case directly inspired by Nicaragua's president, and he wants to take back control of the country from American businesses. In this case, we're talking about bananas. The banana companies were not going to let this happen. And it was mostly this guy, a banana businessman named Sam the Banana Man. He's not going to let this pesky president run his country. No. So he assembles his own militia. He literally buys a surplus Navy ship, loads it up with weapons, and starts his campaign to get this president out. He sails from New Orleans to the coast of Honduras, and he literally invades the country with like a private army. Wait, where's the US government in all this? They also didn't like the political direction of Honduras either, so they just sort of stood back, let this private invasion happen, and then at the critical moment, the US steps in to order a ceasefire, basically bullying the president to step down. He had no way forward, no defense, so he resigned.
It's like trying to frame like this incredibly powerful capitalist doing something that the US government was probably going to do anyway, let's be real, as like it's sort of like a gray area sort of thing rather than this happened. Not just because the US allowed it to happen, but because they were probably going to do it themselves anyway, you know. There's no such thing as like the capitalist class of the USA acting independently like this to invade another fucking country. If it happens, it's because, you know, they already control the government, so what's so weird about them just going over the head of the government that is the enforcer of their interests all over the world anyway?
And the banana man's leader of choice takes the presidency, giving the banana businessman land and a unique status to import anything he needs tax-free. And, wait for it, he refunds him for all of the coup expenses using public Honduran money.
That one is it's not a private thing. That one is a classic US and European thing where like they destroy your country and then they make you pay them back for the privilege.
And literally overthrew the government and made Honduras pay for it. Wow. Okay, so let's move forward to the 50s, where the coup becomes a more useful tool in the American toolkit. There's this new US agency dedicated to collecting and analyzing information from all over the world, meaning for spying.
We just skipped a lot of time.
The Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA.
Have you guys ever heard of the CIA? Do you guys know what that is? This is for aliens.
And it completely revolutionizes the art of the coup. Oh, and at this point, the US is now a full-blown global superpower, no longer just looking in their own neighborhood, but rather at the whole world.
Oh, they're just magically a full-blown global superpower. I mean, this is like 50 years after they colonized the Philippines. I think they were already one. They might not have been the number one, but they were certainly one.
Map, investing huge resources into fighting their global rival and its communist ideology.
Who's the USSR? They spent more time explaining what the CIA is than what the USSR is. I would have thought they would have explained that too, given that this is for aliens.
So this gets us to Iran, 1953. Where Iran had just elected a new star politician, Mohammad Mossadegh. He rises to power believing that Iran must take back control of its most valuable natural resource, oil, which at the time was completely controlled by a British company called the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. We know it today as BP. Mossadegh is done with this. Let's kick the British out and take back our oil.
Yeah.
But like the US, Britain is not happy with Iranians trying to take back their resources. So they warn that if they do this, there will be consequences. So the British catch a quick meeting with the CIA's Middle East guy who was passing through London, and they pitch him on this idea. Let's throw out Mossadegh. The CIA's like, okay, and they kind of sniff communist vibes on Mossadegh with this big desire to nationalize Iran's oil, or at least they tell themselves they do. So
they don't tell themselves they do. This is how they rationalize it to everyone else. They're not telling themselves, like, they don't need to think someone's a communist and not to coup him. They need the dumb Americans to think they're a communist to coup him. It's like, so what is within our interest? Keeping the oil profits for ourselves and the Brits. Okay, how do we justify this to the American public? Oh, communism. Done. That comes after. It's the second step, and I feel like he's mixing it up to make that the first step.
The CIA agrees, and they secretly send this guy to Iran. He's the Middle East bureau chief, Kermit Roosevelt. He's like in his 30s. Oh, and yes, he is the grandson of another big coup guy, Teddy Roosevelt, who I have gone into in other videos. Roosevelt sneaks into Iran and is given $1 million taxpayer dollars to use, quote, in any way that would bring about the fall of Mossadegh. So now there's American...
This entire process was a lot more supported by the US central government than he's framing it. It wasn't just one guy going into Iran. Give me a break, man.
CIA agents in Iran secretly trying to overthrow the government. And it's a rocky start at first with a bunch of failures. But they start using their money to get traction, bribing politicians, religious clerics, and other leaders to say divisive and controversial things about Mossadegh. They hire locals to stage attacks against religious leaders, making it look like they had been ordered to do so by Mossadegh. But really, they were just getting paid by the CIA to do this. And with enough time and money, they create an atmosphere of chaos and hostility and distrust among the public. Oh, and there's weapons. The CIA stashes enough weapons and explosives to support a, quote, 10,000-man guerrilla organization for 6 months, like just in case they need to, like, start a full-on conflict. The result of all of this is more violence and chaos.
Yeah, like for taxpayer money. God, I fucking... Americans always end up making themselves sound like the primary victims of their crimes all around the world. It always somehow comes back to, like, the bad thing about this isn't that it killed, like, thousands of people. The bad thing about it is that it might have cost you, like, $2.50 out of your tax.
engulfs the capital. Shops are being destroyed, bullets are flying into mosques, people are beaten, and thousands of paid demonstrators flood the street. The city falls into anarchy, all of it orchestrated by CIA money. And in the end, this all results in a bloody shootout at Mossadegh's house. He eventually gives up and turns himself in. He's put through a sham trial and found guilty of treason, and sentenced to 3 years in solitary confinement and then house arrest, where he stayed until his death. The previous ruler of Iran, Mohammad Reza Shah, which just means king, had fled the country. But now, with the democratically elected
This is the guy that people like Johnny Harris love nowadays, by the way. They want the Shah back ASAP.
Mossadegh gone, and with the backing of the US and UK, he could charter a flight back into Iran and take control.
The Shah crowns himself in a tradition which goes back 25 centuries. His title is King of Kings, and he becomes Emperor of his nation.
The US really came out on top here.
Anyone else love to crown yourself?
They wanted. They now have an American-friendly dictator in a powerful country in the Middle East, who is now welcoming American oil companies to get in on one of the largest oil reserves on Earth. Under the Shah, Iran becomes a brutal police state. He executed military officers, student leaders, anyone associated with Mossadegh. He set up a secret police force, and life was brutal. So brutal that in 1979, the frustration of Iranians...
This is not true. You're forgetting a very, very important part of this. I'm Googling right now. Iran, Shah, bikini babes. It's like Iran beaches in the 70s before the revolution. Do you see that? She's got her boobies out. Clearly, Iran used to be so much better. In America, we judge people's standard of living by how much skin the girls are showing us. It's that simple.
Burst forth in mass protests that ran the Shah out of office and replaced him with an inspiring new leader who would turn Iran into an Islamic republic, built in part off a foundation of resentment for the West having meddled in their country. The Islamic Republic has held power ever since, and has morphed into the oppressive theocracy we know today, though maybe not for long.
That's your comment on it? Damn, guys. We might have done like a coup against someone who was nationalizing resources for the benefit of their population. But at the end of the day, the state of Iran today hasn't, it's not really our fault. It's bad again, so hopefully we get another coup.
Before we go on, a quick reminder that all of these coups, these plans to overthrow leaders in other countries, did not require American votes or consensus or approval of Congress. It was usually just a few key men in...
This is bullshit. Absolute, total fucking bullshit. American coups like this, even if they're run by the CIA, they always reflect broader government policy. Always, always, always. They always reflect bipartisan foreign policy consensus. And the way it's like no congressional oversight or whatever, most of the time it's done with the support of the executive branch, specifically, essentially on orders of the executive branch, the CIA usually operates. And then the Congress is like, we're a bunch of overpaid shitheads who do nothing useful at all. And we're annoyed that we didn't get to rubber stamp this. Who cares? Great example of that is like the congressional report on CIA activities in Chile, which came out in the 60s, 76, I believe it came out. And most of it is them agreeing with what the CIA did and just like getting their panties in a bunch that they didn't get to approve it. They didn't know about it. They want to feel important. So the problem is, like, it's not that they are against it. It's that they want to be part of it, which is even worse.
Government buildings in Washington, D.C. making this happen. These people would go on to define the Cold War and shape so many covert operations around the world that many of which we'll never know about.
Many of which we'll never know about, yet at the beginning they set impossible standards of evidence that basically means the USA has to have admitted it. If you know that, it can only be intentional that you did that.
The next year, in Guatemala, the CIA tried to pull the same playbook that they used in Iran, once again targeting a leader that the people had elected, but who wanted to take back the country's resources for the people, to break up these American monopolies that controlled the country's electricity and railroad. The president even starts to see
it was mostly about the land reform.
These land from one massive banana company. It was often unused land that he wanted to redistribute to the locals who could farm it and feed their families, and hopefully climb out of the system of endemic poverty in the country. Once again, I made a whole video on this, the geopolitics of bananas in Central America. But the fact is that the US decided that they had to defend the banana companies, or else more communist reforms would spread. So the US president and
He just sort of uncritically says more communist reforms. Like, I feel like he might mean that to come off as, the voice of what the US government is saying, but it really sounds like he's just saying it. In my videos, when I'm quoting someone else or something, or stating what someone else is saying, I kind of make that clear. Or, you say it in a mocking voice or something, but he's just kind of throwing it in there as if it's you could almost take it as his opinion, even if he doesn't mean it to be like that.
Secretary of State ordered an overthrow, and the CIA got right to work. The CIA hand selects a
See,
leader.
there you go. The Secretary of State ordered an overthrow. The Secretary of State, that's the executive branch. The Secretary of State is only going to be doing that if the president wants him to be doing it. We're not talking like the rogue CIA doing shit by themselves. We're talking about the different branches of the American government working together to fuck over another country for the material interests of American corporations. That's what happens.
That they want to be in power. And then they start giving equipment and training to a bunch of Guatemalan exiles and private soldiers. They set up a secret operation base on the outskirts of Miami. They start delivering weapons to the Panama Canal. But like the other coups, it can't just all be about weapons. They gotta own the information space. So they create a radio station that sounds like it's a local Guatemalan radio station, but really it's being operated out of a small town in Florida. And they start publishing fake news about an uprising, unrest.
See, guys, even 1953, the Gusanos were already at it.
A rebellion. And then, at the same time, the fighters that the CIA had trained and armed invades Guatemala. Pilots start dropping bombs on fuel tanks and military posts and airports. But they weren't starting a full-on war. They weren't trying to cause real damage. They wanted it to feel like a domestic uprising, like a war was on the horizon, to freak people out. And for many, it totally worked. They thought that this was a real uprising and had no idea that the CIA was behind it all. But the president knew what was up. He had messed with the USA, and now he's hearing about it. Military leaders in his circle are feeling the pressure from the big bully from the north, and they turn on him, and he eventually surrenders. On his way out, the president addresses his people, makes it very clear that, quote, the United Fruit Company, in collaboration with the United States, is responsible for what is happening to us. And just like that, one president is out, and the hand-picked CIA option is in. This new regime is brutal and goes on to do horrible things, detaining people they thought were communists, killing prisoners, breaking up labor unions, and in the process, restoring the banana company's land, and ensuring that they maintained their hold on this economy. This kicks off an era in Guatemala of more political assassinations and instability, something that still plagues the country today. And yet to this day, there is no evidence that the Soviets were ever slightly interested in Guatemala. Communism
Would it have been okay if they were?
was once again the excuse, but really this was about securing American business interests, tearing a
Yeah, so was every other one.
country apart for bananas.
Bananas taste the best and are the best for you.
All right, let's go to Africa. So it's 1960 here in the center of Africa, a country called Congo. They just gained independence from Belgium, and they have an election. And this guy, Patrice Lumumba, wins, becomes the prime minister. But immediately, over in Washington, the communist alarm bells instantly start sounding off. Because we're in the middle of the
What did the communist alarm bells sound like?
Cold War, and Congo is a place full of tons of natural resources, including loads of uranium, the main ingredient for nuclear bombs. This is at a time when Americans are keeping gas masks next to their bed and have hordes of canned goods in their basements. And officials in Washington can't risk Congo falling into the influence of the Soviet Union. So they start focusing on this prime minister. The CIA director called him, quote, an urgent and prime objective that should, quote, be a high priority of our covert action. So they pull a more political coup than the ones before. They start allying with Lumumba's political enemies and Congo's former colonizer Belgium. They bribe politicians, they fund protests and labor movements, and they circulate propaganda, similar ingredients to the previous coups. And when the moment is right, all these bribed politicians do what the CIA asked them to. They remove Lumumba from power, and the CIA is right there giving money and intelligence and advice to the new government. This political solution was actually not the first try. The CIA had tried to assassinate Lumumba in the past, but all of those attempts failed, which is why they turned to hijacking and manipulating.
What are the comments on this like? Hold on. I mean, pretty normal. Okay. It's just, like, why is this video being made? What is the point? I don't want to go straight to the conclusion, because I might skip something important.
Congolese politics, a brand new democracy, supporting the people who would eventually go on to put Lumumba in front of a Congolese and Belgian firing squad, making this effectively a political assassination, supported from an ocean away. And yet there's so much gray area in these coups. In this case, it's really tough to prove that the CIA's support was the key factor in Lumumba's assassination.
Wow, they're doing the thing. You know, we didn't matter. It was actually a local uprising. Right, we know about all of these like incredibly pervasive, an incredibly pervasive campaign that we did to make a coup happen, and then the coup happened, but it wasn't us. You can't prove it was us. We didn't say it was us.
It's debated to this day. An effective foreign-sponsored coup works like this, operating in the shadows, fueling divisions.
No, it doesn't work like that. The only reason it can still be debated is because they haven't released all of their documents on it, which would obviously immediately prove that, yeah, it was all them the whole time, which is why they don't release them. That's the only reason there's a debate, because there's incomplete evidence, and one of the parties, which, could hypothetically absolve itself by being transparent with the evidence, chooses not to release the evidence. I wonder why. Could it be because the evidence would implicate them even more? Yeah, that's why.
appealing to the worst demons of the people on the ground, through money, through influence. All right, let's move on to the Caribbean in the 1960s. There's a
I like how Cuba's just been skipped over completely.
brutal dictator here in the Dominican Republic. I mean, this guy's really bad. He's rumored to feed his opponents to sharks. But
It's really bad.
anyway, what the US cares about is that there's fear that a communist revolution could happen at any moment. So the CIA sends weapons to a group of hitmen who go assassinate this guy. It ends up being an ambush and a car chase. They're successful in taking him out, ending his 31-year rule. And eventually the US sends in forces to occupy the DR to make sure that a leftist candidate doesn't come to power. They restore order, and eventually a US-friendly candidate is elected. Okay, so now we have to
Wow, that was just like the most whitewashed thing I've ever seen in my life. Jesus. They even tried to make it sound like kind of good.
head over to Vietnam in 1963.
This one's like an actual straight-up invasion and genocide. It's just a coup now.
And boy, this is a way bigger one than we have time for.
Motive, fighting communism. It's always just fighting communism. Fighting communism. That's motive, fighting communism. No. Like, why is the motive to fight communism, right? Why would they want to fight communism? Think about it for 2 seconds. Because if there is a even nominally communist government, it's going to do things that are not amenable to the interests of the most powerful capitalists in the world, whose interests the US exists to protect, especially American ones. That's why it's not fighting communism. We might as well put like motive to expand capitalism. That's way more accurate. You can't just take the fighting communism narrative at face value.
We're trying to focus on the coup element of this. Vietnam was divided in two, between communist and pro-Western governments.
Why? Why was it divided in two? I'm just going to gloss over
the U.S.
that.
needs the South to stay on their side, but Washington starts to lose confidence in this guy, the South's leader. He's losing a grip on the country, and the U.S.
Oh no. The US couped one fascist puppet and replaced him with another. I don't care.
fears that communism will take over the whole country of Vietnam.
It should have, and it did.
CIA rolls up its sleeves.
That's all. This is all they're going to do. They're just going to coup him. They didn't like send 50,000 soldiers there who were all fighting at once. They didn't, overall, it was like 300,000 total. There wasn't like a massive war. They didn't carpet bomb the entire country of North Vietnam. Like they didn't do like multiple massacres, nothing like that. Just a coup.
It's time for another coup. This time they focus on a South Vietnamese general who also doesn't love the president, and he agrees to do the CIA's bidding. And when given the signal, the general directs his military to
This is like talking about like a coup by fucking Himmler against Hitler.
Seize the airport and radio stations, and they block off highways. They march to the presidential palace. A bloody shootout goes down, and this President Diem, escapes. He happens to be with his brother, but it's not going well for them, so he realizes that he needs to set up a meeting to surrender. They're going to meet at a Catholic church. This was probably going to be a peaceful meeting, but when the generals arrive, they just kill him on the spot.
I don't care.
Saying, quote, to kill the weed, you must pull up the roots. Meaning, in order to solve the problem, Diem must die. Exile was not enough. Now, the US actually didn't plan for this to happen. They didn't want to kill this guy. It was not an official order from Washington. But they made this coup happen. JFK is said to be really distraught about this. The first American Catholic president behind the coup that killed the first Vietnamese Catholic president.
The first Vietnamese Catholic president? Buddy, he was not the president of anything resembling a legitimate country, let alone Vietnam. He was the leader of a French/US backed puppet state installed to deny the Vietnamese people their liberation from colonialism, and the US then imposed a genocide on Vietnam in which more than 1 million people were killed for no reason at all, just because they wanted to uphold their shitty little southern puppet state. Quite a bit different.
And incidentally,
oh, John F. Kennedy was destroyed. Oh, sad. I'm so sad. I can't believe they killed the guy instead of just letting him live in exile or whatever. Who cares?
JFK was assassinated 20 days later. And one national security journalist argues that Diem's assassination actually had a greater impact on American history than the murder of JFK, because it locked the US into a decade of conflict in Vietnam, which...
No, the US would have fucking gone to war anyway, because obviously the North wasn't just going to leave half their country in the hands of a colonial puppet regime. Vietnamese people fucking hated it. Like 80% of the population supported the Communist Party. They weren't locked into shit. They weren't forced into this. You see the way he frames it? It's like insane. They chose to go there because they decided invading Vietnam and imposing their colonial will on that country was better for the interests of global capitalism, especially their own.
Ballooned into a long war, ending in an embarrassing defeat and a
ballooned into a long war.
Political crisis at home. One of the few coups where the US actually had to deal with the aftermath. Okay, let's blast through a few of these really quickly. I'm going to skirt over some details here.
Really quickly.
1964, and Brazil is potentially veering off.
Every single time he literally takes the US government's justification at face value. Oh, communism! Communism!
Into communism with the rise of a new leftist leader. Lucky for the CIA, there's already a coup being plotted against him, so the US military just shows up with ships off the coast of Brazil. They airlift in a bunch of ammunition and supplies. They didn't end up having to do much, actually. Instead, they just stood by with reinforcements and watched the Brazilian coup go down. The leftist leader goes down, and a new...
classic American framing. Nothing like this could ever happen without the approval of the USA, without the approval of not just the hegemonic global power, but the approval of the hegemonic regional power as well. Obviously, they're even stronger in Latin America itself. It's not like, they just sort of stood by and just in case they were needed. What actually happens is they give their diplomatic approval. If you take over, you have our support. That is by far the most important thing, because without US support, without US backing for this sort of coup, the regime that takes the place of the previous government would immediately collapse, because the US is the hegemonic economic power of the region, of the world. Without them at least agreeing to turn a blind eye towards it, you can't get very far.
Leader comes in. In 1973, there's a coup in Chile that is a very complicated story with conflicting accounts, and we went down a super deep rabbit hole, and we've decided that because the evidence is not rock solid, we're going to cut it for time, but definitely some crazy shit went down. I'm not saying it didn't.
What? The evidence is not rock solid? Are you fucking kidding me? The US literally did everything possible to make this coup happen. It's unfucking believable. They spent 10 years funding right-wing parties. They literally gave the gun that was used to assassinate the head of the armed forces who was refusing to carry out a coup. They gave the gun to the assassin that killed that man. They funded protests, strikes. They were clandestinely funding the country's biggest newspaper to spread propaganda. I've heard this argument before, but only from idiots before, never from such a big channel. It's the way that this argument works, it's the US didn't literally order Pinochet himself to carry out the coup. They just did everything possible to make the coup happen. Not just the CIA at all either, because Chile was also massively sanctioned. It was made an international, at least a Western pariah by the government of Richard Nixon. So they did everything possible to make life in Chile a living hell, to fund opposition parties, they literally gave the gun to an assassin who killed a military leader who was refusing to carry out a coup for them, which then directly led to Pinochet being put into the position that he was in, that allowed him to carry out the coup, and had obviously created the circumstances for which the coup would happen, for which the coup could happen. But because they didn't literally tell Pinochet on the phone, do the coup now, they're oh, the evidence isn't clear. We didn't have any part in that. For an analogy that Americans will understand, it's saying that because Trump didn't literally order January 6th himself, didn't literally organize it himself, didn't sign some paper saying that he was endorsing it, it means that it wasn't his fault, because the last 4 years before that led towards that happening were obviously something you have to take into account, just so that the Americans understand. It's like driving someone to suicide, telling them every single day to do it, and then when they do it, being but they did it themselves. It's just so fucking dumb. Of all the coups, they even put it on a level lower than Brazil in terms of US involvement, which is just absurd.
Okay, we're back in Africa, and it's the 80s, and over here in Libya...
We're back in Africa. You missed the whole fucking lot in the Americas, man. Only 2 coups happened there, apparently. Operation Condor was apparently Operation fucking baby chick that just hatched. No Condor involved.
The dictator, Muammar Gaddafi, was making lots of trouble in the region.
The dictator? Well, we just skipped ahead really fucking far. The dictator was making lots of trouble in the region,
funding terrorist groups and working to expand his influence all over the region. Then he gets a call from his neighbor Chad asking for help against a rebellion. Gaddafi eagerly sends 4,000 troops to occupy a huge part of the country and makes friends with the new president by helping him exile his rival. And soon Gaddafi's getting greedy and threatening to merge Chad into Libya. The US is not into this. So Ronald Reagan fires up the well-oiled coup machine, launching a covert war, sending weapons and cash to rebels in Chad, and supporting that political opponent who was ousted, helping him fight back. And it works. The president of Chad has to flee, and the US-backed and supported leader comes to power.
A lot of these aren't even coups. That's just a civil war, like a proxy war.
And now there's a conflict, and the CIA continues arming the war even after this guy is in office. The new US-backed leader rules brutally for 8 years, until he's eventually overthrown by a military officer, and in 2013 he was charged with crimes against humanity, torture, and war crimes.
But it's okay, though, because Gaddafi was bad.
Okay, now let's go to this little island in 1983.
This is just a fucking military invasion, man. It's not a coup, it's just a military invasion. Imagine calling, like, the Russian invasion of Ukraine a coup attempt.
Communism again, and the US sends 2,000 troops to invade this small remote island and remove their communist leader. They didn't really know much about this small island, and they literally had to use tourism maps to plan their invasion. Anyway, American forces move in, overwhelm the Grenadian fighters who happen to be joined by their Cuban allies. The government collapses, and the US-friendly leader comes to power.
They skip so much. Like, they skip so much in Latin America in the 70s, 60s, and 80s.
Okay, back down to Central America. It's 1989, and we're here in Panama, where the US has control of a very important canal. And luckily, the Panamanian dictator has been very friendly to American interests. But the US starts losing confidence in this guy, wondering if he's really the best choice, ensuring the US maintain easy access to their vital canal.
I'm pretty sure Joe Biden had a lot to do with this. Extra context. Not just the CIA thing. Joe Biden was a massive fucking champion of the invasion of Panama, which he framed as like a defensive action. It was a defensive action to defend American citizens. Meanwhile, 1,000 Panamanian civilians were murdered during the invasion. Obviously, what it was a fucking military invasion by the USA to overthrow their own guy who had turned against them so that they could continue to have unrestricted access to the Panama Canal. Because the only reason that Panama exists in the first place is because the USA basically partitioned it from Colombia to give themselves a canal that they would have the free use of. Panama is literally a canal country. It's not a real country.
And it didn't help that this guy was indicted in Florida on drug trafficking and money laundering charges.
Oh, no, I was indicted by the US. Americans love to do that, where they just indict people in other countries on things that they did in other countries.
Gotta get him out. But
Apparently, but it's always made up shit, of course.
straw that broke the camel's back for this guy was when Panamanian troops killed an unarmed American soldier in Panama City. The US is
What was the unarmed American soldier doing in Panama City?
done with this guy, so they invade Panama with 27,000 troops. Panama's military is crushed, and the dictator is eventually arrested and sentenced to 40 years in prison.
Ah, great. Sentenced by the Americans. It's like just an entirely ridiculous concept. Like, Americans invading a country and then the Americans sentencing someone to prison for like a crime that they were like indicted for in the USA somehow?
And the US ensures access to its canal after all. Okay, so now it's the end of the 1980s, and the Soviets are invading Afghanistan and are meeting resistance from a bunch of fighters from all over the world who have come to Afghanistan to fight back against the Soviet.
Dude, most of these aren't even coups, like, honestly. It's just invasion.
Occupation. Many of them with fundamentalist religious
Or like proxy war.
motivations. But the US doesn't care about their motivation. They just care that they're willing to fight against the Soviets and the Soviets' puppet, the Afghan president. And it totally works. With the help of the US, these fighters push the Soviets back and successfully run the Afghan president out of office. And as he's being run out of office, he forebodingly warns the Americans that if they leave Afghanistan in the hands of these fighters, that it would, quote, be turned into a center for terrorism. And his prophecy was completely fulfilled. Those US-funded fighters were people whose names we know today. Osama bin Laden, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the guy who started the group.
Gotta give him credit. They're real ones.
That would eventually become ISIS. Those same weapons that the US sent to counter the Soviets and to effect regime change in Afghanistan would go on to be used against American soldiers years later, when the US was back, orchestrating yet another regime change after 9/11, against the very groups they once enabled. The US would eventually leave Afghanistan, only to find the country immediately falling back into Taliban rule. We're almost at the end of our list, and we're now in modern day. It's 2003, and 150,000 American troops invade Iraq.
This is a coup? This is a coup? The invasion of Iraq was a coup?
They say that they are there to find and destroy weapons of mass destruction, but their main focus is taking out this guy.
The US was there to make a ton of fucking money. They weren't there for any other reason. They wanted to get rid of Saddam, hopefully install a nice little pro-US puppet regime there, which would further their goal of making a ton of fucking money in the Middle East, while also making a ton of money by destroying Iraq intentionally and then rebuilding it, and giving themselves a bunch of contracts over its natural resources, primarily oil, basically whatever they get their hands of. And they also paid for these contracts with money from the Iraqi state itself, which was mostly funded by money from oil. But it's always like, WMDs? No, man. You can't just look at the like justification that they're giving him and take it at face value all the time. Think for 2 seconds about why they're really doing this shit.
Saddam Hussein, which they do in a matter of weeks. Saddam fleeing into hiding and President Bush declaring mission accomplished, establishing an American-friendly government.
He was right. The mission was accomplished. They got what they wanted out of the Iraq War. They got what they wanted. Lots of the fucking money. Lots of money redistributed from Iraq to American companies and from the American state to American companies. That's why they invaded. It went swimmingly for them. Bush was not wrong when he said mission accomplished, because he never gave a single fucking shit about what would happen to the people of Iraq, about Iraq being destroyed or whatever. Didn't give a fuck. The reason why it was invaded was very simple. Make the money. And they made the money. Lots of it. Mission accomplished. He was right. Cope with your liberal idealism all you want. It's true.
In Iraq, creating once again a negative byproduct by alienating huge...
Oops, we made a negative byproduct. It's framed at, I see it now. It's framed as like good intentions, bad results. But if you have the bad results 100 times, maybe the intentions aren't actually so good.
Swaths of the Iraqi people and army who form a bunch of anti-American rebel groups that go on to fight against the American occupation. Some morphing into groups like ISIS who wreak all kinds of havoc on the region. To this day. Once again, I made a whole video about this topic. Go check it out. Iraq remains a place of deep political instability. Trust in government is extremely low. And the question of how and why we did this expensive, horrific, destructive coup is still something that there aren't really good answers to.
No, it's so simple. It's so simple. I just told you, man. It took me 3 seconds. We'll never know why this happened. We'll never know why we invaded this country and intentionally destroyed it, and then gave ourselves a bunch of contracts to rebuild it, and gave ourselves a bunch of contracts to exploit its resources, and paid for all of these contracts with money that we stole from the Iraqi state. We'll never know why we did that. It's a mystery. It's all up in the air. Who knows? Who knows, man? We'll never know.
Again, you can go watch my video for more on that. And this gets us to the final coup on our list. It's 2011 during a wave of protests spreading throughout this region, trying to take down all these strongmen dictators, one of which was this guy, Muammar Gaddafi, the same Gaddafi we were talking about earlier who was like taking over Chad. He's still here and he's still a very horrible dude. And there's worry that he's going to potentially massacre all of these pro-democracy protesters.
They literally just take American justifications, like the State Department spokesperson justification, everything at face value. It's maddening, actually.
Feels like it must get involved to save these protesters.
The US feels like it must get involved to save these protesters. No, the reason why the US got involved was in large part simply to pay back fucking France for helping them in Afghanistan. Because France felt that Gaddafi, who was always very independent of Western foreign policy aims, was a competitor of their interests in Africa. That's literally the only reason why.
They rally their NATO allies to help them. But at some point, the mission switches to total regime change. We don't know exactly how this happened. Only the...
Oops. How is it possible that we were bombing a country but we didn't intend for the government to be overthrown? Who could have known that would have happened?
The people in the room do. But is it surprising? We've seen this long arc of the US using the coup as a force for getting their way in.
The problem with this video is the guy obscures what getting their way actually means, what their way is. For him, it's like just a thoroughly unrelated series of oopsies, many of which had good intentions and bad results, rather than any sort of materialistic explanation for what happened.
International conflict. It's a tried and true tool in the American foreign policy toolkit, so it's not surprising that a coup becomes a solution during these difficult decision-making processes. So anyway...
This wasn't a coup either. Like, they literally bombed the fucking country themselves. That's just an invasion. Even though they didn't get boots on the ground, I mean, like, sending in, like, planes to do dozens and dozens of bombing runs in support of, like, a rebel faction in a civil war. That's just intervening in a civil war. Like, come on.
It becomes Gaddafi, and now NATO drones are firing missiles at his convoy, and he eventually gets captured and gets killed on the spot. Libya has been in chaos ever since, but it's not like it was a great place under Gaddafi. And
it was a whole fucking lot better. Like, come on, the reason they took him out has nothing to do with it being a great place or not, or with him being bad or not, or with massacres or anything. The only thing it has anything to do with is the fact that Gaddafi was someone they couldn't control, who went against their geopolitical interests, that's all.
Once again, we're in a gray area where we don't know the history that didn't happen, or how things could have turned out different if the US didn't get involved. That debate lives on.
They're always like, there's always a debate. This is really not just a fucking debate, man. Unless you're like a fucking Anne Applebaum or something, writing like a column for the New York Times, there's no real debate.
Okay, so that's our list. These are our coups that we decided to go over in this video. There are so many more that we could have mentioned. My purpose in doing this broad back-to-back history of American-led coups was so that we can see patterns that emerge. How a rising superpower
You have not seen any of the patterns at all. You've just, I don't see how
became
you've
really
noticed any of
good
them.
at removing leaders that didn't align with their way of seeing the world, or in a lot of cases, who were not friendly
Their
to
way of
American
seeing
business
the
interests.
world.
But
Or in a lot of, that's all of the cases. All of them. Always.
let's be clear, the US didn't invent this. This is something that powerful countries and empires have always done.
And?
What characterizes US-led coups, especially during the Cold War, was how the overthrow of these governments often stamped out new democracies, budding democratic movements, replacing them with authoritarian leaders who would go on to oppress the people with the support and backing of the United
Wow, it might just be that the USA doesn't actually like freedom and democracy after all.
States, and in the process, redirecting the country's history. Lately, Russia has been meddling in the election process of the United States.
Are you comparing this to that? Are you comparing Russia buying some Facebook ads to say vote for Donald Trump to fucking the USA like overthrowing like democratically elected nominally leftist leaders like 100 times? Oh no, now they're doing it to us. Damn.
And I've been reflecting
Fucking hell. No, they're not. They couldn't even if they wanted to.
on my feelings towards that. The violation of having an external power, sowing doubt and polarization and fear.
No, you don't know anything. Look, literally, he even knows it. Like the icons, it's like Russia sending Facebook logos into the USA. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Russia paying like troll farms to make Facebook posts to get people to vote for Trump. That's the same thing as you overthrowing like some fucking Latin American leader or something to install a fascist. Are you kidding me? Guy, Trump would have won the election with or without Russia, okay? Give us a fucking break. Holy shit.
In my own democracy, in my own society. It feels like such
You
a
don't have a
violation.
democracy.
And it is.
It feels like such a violation. Oh my god. Man, if you want to like have what you did to other countries to the US happen, it's not like this. It's not like this. Okay? It would be a whole lot fucking worse than this. Jesus Christ, this is unbelievable.
This is giving me just a tiny taste of what it feels like to have an outside power
Oh my God.
pulling the strings in your country.
Russia pulls the string how is that even materially possible? How would they do that even if they wanted to? Such a poor, like, weak country that can't even fucking successfully invade Ukraine. And you think it's like meaningfully intervening in American politics? Jesus.
Tearing it apart for their own purposes.
I was saying earlier, I want to see where they go with this. I never could have seen this one coming. I never could have seen this coming. Holy crap.
And in the process, creating more problems for the people and for the United States itself, undermining any semblance of democracy or development.
It's almost like they don't care about democracy. It's almost like the entire idea of liberal democracy is this is a smokescreen for defending the interests of the bourgeoisie. And the second that this smokescreen stops working as intended, stops working as designed, it's time to install a dictator who will ensure their interests are protected. I mean, yeah, not much more to say.
Name of keeping the US on top and dominant over the globe.
Okay, wistful ambient music. I've had enough. Man, wow, that I never could have seen that coming. That was quite something. Yeah, that was very weird turn at the end there. But yeah, typical liberal thing. Typical liberal sort of immaterial understanding of why the USA and other like European imperial powers do things. Like, how does this keep happening? I can't believe it. It just keeps happening. How does it keep happening? We don't know. We'll never know. Incomprehensible.